Hello, everyone, and welcome to the December presentation of the Friends of History First Wednesday Lecture Series. These monthly lectures are being provided free of charge by the Friends of History with the support from the New Mexico History Museum. Today, we are happy to welcome Fred Hagstrom, the Emeritus Ray Shupak Nathan Professor of Art at Carleton College in Minnesota. Fred's presentation is being held in collaboration with the New Mexico History Museum, which is hosting the Smithsonian Museum's traveling exhibition, Righting a Wrong, Japanese Americans and World War II. Here to introduce Fred and speak more on the exhibit is Miss Kathy Notanakola, Museum Curator for 19th and 20th century New Mexico history. Kathy?
Thank you, Ben. It is my great pleasure to introduce this presentation by Fred Hagstrom titled Deeply Honored, Two Heroes of the 442nd. And as Ben mentioned, this presentation coincides with a Smithsonian traveling exhibition that examines the complicated history and impact of Executive Order 9066 that led to the incarceration of Japanese Americans following the attack on Pearl Harbor. This presentation is about the incarceration of people of Japanese ancestry during this time. It is based on two books, Deeply Honored and Returning Home, and covers the Student Relocation Project, an initiative that allowed some students of college age to leave the incarceration camps and to pursue a college education, as well as those who left camp to volunteer for military service. Our speaker recently moved to New Mexico after a career teaching at Carleton College in Minnesota, and his books and prints are held in numerous public collections, including the Library of Congress. He has spoken on the topic at the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles, the Wing Luke Museum in Seattle, and the Bainbridge Island Museum of Art near Seattle. Now I would like to introduce to you our speaker, Fred Hagstrom.
Thank you, Kathy and Ben, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to everyone here and to be included in this exhibition in the museum in Santa Fe. And I am going to talk about two artist books that I've worked on, and this is a subject that's very near and dear to me, and I was happy to see this exhibit come to Santa Fe. Okay, this is a copy of the removal order that appeared shortly after the president's order. It gave people of Japanese ancestry just a few weeks to show up for removal. And what's important to think about is that this wasn't only based, in my opinion, on the start of the war in Pearl Harbor, that there was a prelude to this in which there was a good deal of tension about a wish on some West Coast communities to exclude people of Japanese descent. There was anxiety about how much Japanese people had bought up farms and that sort of thing. There were even some movements in some areas to exclude Japanese children from attending schools. So I think when we know about this, it's common to just think that it was a response to the war. But there was a backdrop before it that I think is really important to know about. And then coupled with war hysteria, anger over Pearl Harbor, it had its own momentum. But I personally feel that racism was there before the beginning of the war and played a role in this. Next. This is a map of the camps, and I want you to notice that there are three different kinds of camps. What are called, the terms for these have changed so much, but assembly centers, War Department camps, and then Justice Department internment camps, we use the word incarceration. So the assembly centers, well, no, I think I'll begin with the Justice Department camps. So on the night of December 7th, the night of Pearl Harbor, there was already a list and people were rounded up, mostly business leaders, prominent people in the Japanese American community, and they were arrested and taken to these Justice Department camps. This was another complication that would play out later on, because once the larger order happened, it was sometimes difficult for them to move to those long-term camps to be with their families. And then the assembly centers. These were really rough living situations. So people were supposed to show up with just a suitcase, not really knowing where they were going to go. And the assembly centers were mostly in fairgrounds and racetracks and things like that, often with people housed in animal stalls. So it was very difficult. They were there for a certain amount of time before they were finally relocated to the main camps that would stay in business for several years. And you can see those here. And I'll note that Santa Fe had one of the Justice Department camps. But another place that I'll mention, if you look at the map, is Crystal City. This was an unusual camp. One of the things that happened there was that people from Latin America of Japanese descent were brought from places like Peru to Crystal City and held to hopefully be used as in hostage exchange, prisoner exchange. They weren't used in that capacity, but they spent the entire war period there, and in fact were not released until 1947. So that's an aspect of this that's a lot of people don't know about. But of course, the main thing was the relocation of people from the West Coast. I will note, however, that it did not include Hawaii, which had the largest Japanese population, in part because there was some fears that the economy would collapse without if the Japanese were removed from Hawaii. Photos like this really abound, and this photo has always really stuck with me, this sense of insecurity. So you have to remember that these people were showing up and being transported to a place that they didn't know where they were going, and they had no idea how long they were going to be there. And this is for all people of Japanese descent and the exclusion zone on the West Coast, regardless of citizenship. Many were American citizens, and regardless of age. But photos like this I find quite moving. This is a room at Carleton College, and this was really the start of my interest in this. So this was the room that was dedicated to Frank Shigamura, who I will talk about more. He was a student that came to Carleton. But I did have a little bit of background with this, and it has to do with Gordon Hirabayashi. So when I attended college, I had no clue about what to register for or anything. I really didn't know anything about going to college. And kind of accidentally, I ended up in an introduction to sociology class. The professor had been the office mate at the University of Washington of Gordon Hirabayashi when they were both graduate students. And Gordon Hirabayashi was one of the 3 test cases that went to the Supreme Court that tested about the removal of Japanese. And my teacher told me that when the indictment came, they were in the office together, and Mr. Hirabayashi opened it up and it said, "The people of the United States versus Gordon Hirabayashi." And he looked at my teacher and said, "Done, they got me outnumbered." And what my teacher did was he brought in a number of people who had been in camp, families and that sort of thing. And they talked about how their lives had been changed because of this experience. And why this really meant a lot to me was that I knew nothing about this before I went to college. It was never touched upon in my high school education. My family never knew about it or talked about it. And for me, it was just a really important moment, not only to know about this event, but also to think, oh boy, college is going to be different. I'm going to be exposed to things that I didn't know about. And this great sort of principle of, if I didn't know about this, what else don't I know? Which I think is really a great way to go about your studies. This is Frank Shigamura. And his name was on the plaque. He was one of the first students to come to Carleton College, and he came under the Student Relocation Council, which was a movement to get college-age students out of the camps to continue their educations in colleges and universities that were outside the exclusion zone. And this man is very important for that. This is John Nason. John Nason, at the time of the beginning of the war, was a very young college president at Swarthmore, which is a Quaker school. And what he did was he wrote to colleges and universities all across the country, asking them to provide space and, if possible, scholarship for students to leave the camps to continue their education. And at the same time, he set up a kind of a service on the West Coast, a placement service, to help the students enter different programs. And this was everything. This was professional programs, graduate programs, nursing, etc., as well as undergraduate programs. 4,000 students left the camps during the war to attend college and university in other parts of the US, again, often on scholarship. And Mr. Nason was just highly, highly revered in the Japanese American community because of this thing that he had done, even though it's something that many people don't know about. And this is John Nason's graduation photograph when he graduated from Carleton College in 1929. Just to give you an example, so this is the Japanese Student Club at the University of Washington. And one of the interesting things is that when they needed to leave and first go to camp, and then if they were lucky, move from camp to a college or university elsewhere in the country, they ended up attending universities and colleges that they would have never probably even thought about attending, because most of them came from large schools on the West Coast, like the University of Washington, University of California, Berkeley, et cetera. And what kind of a sideline of this is they ended up participating in the lives of these really different college environments that they might not have anticipated, and brought something very different to those schools. This is an example. This is from McAllister College. This is two students whose boyfriends have enlisted. So the student on the left is at McAllister in St. Paul, thanks to the Relocation Council. And that's she and her roommate both showing portraits of their boyfriends or fiancés. This is billed as, or was billed as, the smallest basketball team in the nation. This is the Kalamazoo College basketball team of, I think, 1943. Give you just an idea of how these students would show up in just a totally different part of the country. And this is the Carleton College basketball team of the year. And you can see the same thing with several Japanese players on the team. This is Gyo Obata, who you might know is a very well-known architect. His father was Chiro Obata, who's a really prominent Japanese-American artist who was teaching at the University of California, Berkeley, before they were all sent to camp. And in Gyo Obata's case, he participated in the Student Relocation Council to attend graduate school in architecture at Washington University of St. Louis, and went on to become an extremely prominent architect. One of the buildings that you might know by him is the National Air and Space Museum on the Mall. So you can think of him as a young person trying to continue his education and kind of coming up against this bureaucracy. The first time he applied to leave to go to the university, he was told, no, I think we'll just leave you in camp for a while. Eventually that was reversed, and then you think of the career that he went on. And I like to think of 4,000 students, the various things that their life paths might have taken because of that. And he's such an interesting example. And this is the Cosmopolitan Club from Carleton College, 1943. And up in the upper right, you can see it includes Frank Shigamura. So now I'm going to be talking about my book. So this is an artist book. So for these, just to explain the background of artist books, it's basically an art project in book form. I do the research, I do the images and the text, as well as all the binding and everything. And it's a bit like a movie. The pages sort of, move by as you turn them, and you think about the kind of rhythm of the book and how it can tell a story. So even the cover is important. So in this case, I use Japanese silk for the cover, and just with this single line of barbed wire. And then you have an end sheet. So in any book, there's a page that's glued into the inner cover. So for my end sheets, I use the ID cards that were given to the people when they were incarcerated and arrived in camp. So this is the first page that you would see when you would open the book. And then this is the title page. This isn't any particular, like this isn't Frank or anybody that I particularly knew. These kind of come from sort of stock photographs that I found and that sort of thing. Many of the images came from an organization that I encourage you to check out called Densho from Seattle, that it really puts together a lot of the history about this. So I'm just going to go through some of the pages of the book, and almost all the text comes from archives. So some of them are just sort of statistics and then archival letters. So in this page on the right is one of the examples of the many letters that John Nason would write to colleges and universities, updating them on the status of the Japanese students. And at this point, it's very early on. There was about 350 students who had attended 90-some colleges. And Mr. Nason is reporting that they're showing up, they're being accepted, and it's working out. But then he's also sort of hitting up the colleges saying anything more that you can do, because there's a lot more students that want to participate in this. This is an example of a military photograph with young men joining the 442nd. And it really starts to talk about the Frank Shigamura story. So I'm going to go into that now. So Frank was the very first student that came to Carleton under the Student Relocation Council. Eventually 12 would come during the course of the war. And in the year that he was at Carleton, he went down with the other Carleton students to the draft board to enlist. 60 students went down, 59 were accepted. Frank was rejected, and it was based on his Japanese descent. So he wrote to the dean of the college saying, I should have a right to serve. And the dean took up his cause and spent the entire academic year sort of writing the draft board and working his way up the Army to convince them that Frank was loyal and should be allowed to participate and to enlist. And so on the right side here is one of the letters from the dean of the college, just saying what I just said, that he's sincere, that he wants to participate. Frank would later describe this as the best year of his life. So he had one really great year at college. And then towards the end of the year, the decision changed and he was called up and he went to basic training. This is an example of one of the funeral photos of the soldiers that didn't return. So I want to talk a little bit about the 442nd. The 442nd was formed mostly from Japanese, American citizens of Japanese descent from the mainland, but also with a large contingent of Japanese descent soldiers from Hawaii. And it put together these two groups. And at first, they were culturally very, very different. And I listened to this story by Senator Inouye, and he described the kind of initial conflicts that happened between these groups. So they were sent to basic training together, but at that point, the Army was quite concerned that they were really never going to come together because there were fights and they just were not getting along. But what they did was most of the students, not students, most of the soldiers from the mainland had enlisted from camps. So they had been already relocated to camps across the country. And what the Army did was they took the Hawaiian students and they sent them to visit one of the camps. And Senator Inouye said that on the road there was lots of laughing and singing songs and that kind of stuff. And then they saw the kind of place where their counterparts, their mainland counterparts, had enlisted from. And it changed everything. And from that point, they were a solid unit. On the right is the letter of December 2nd, 1944. And this is the letter from the dean that did all those previous letters that got Frank into the Army, and is writing the parents who are still in camp, expressing his condolence. And he's saying that he feels a certain amount of responsibility and the sadness. He says, it makes me regret all the deeper that after showing such patriotism, Frank was not able to return again to the United States. This is a booklet. So when the war was concluded, Carleton College printed up a booklet of the 50-some young men, Carleton alums and Carleton students that had died in the war. And they sent them to all the families. And so Mr. and Mrs. Shigamura, at this point after the war, they were out of the camp and they received this booklet. This is the honor roll of at Minidoka camp. This is where the Shigamuras were and where Frank left to enlist. And this is the letter that Mrs. Shigamura sent to Carleton College after receiving the booklet. And this is really why I did this book. So I'm just going to read this one letter that she read in response. So just picture her. She's spent several years in camp, has lost her only son, has lost most of her possessions and that sort of thing. And she receives this booklet from Carleton. She says, "We deeply feel honored in having Frank's picture in a memorial booklet honoring Carleton College Gold Star men. It is hard to realize that Frank will never return. I can only say that I'm grateful that he was able to serve his country, God, and us all. I shall always be proud to be the mother of a true American." Frank is often mentioned in his letters about the fair treatment and kindness he received from both the faculty and the students of Carleton College. I cannot find words adequate enough to fully express our thanks. We are ever and ever so grateful to you all. So I find that letter very moving. I read it when I was in the archives, and it really got to me. The idea that she had gone through what she had gone through, the losses that she and her husband had faced, and to express herself in that way was, to me, just really phenomenal. And what I try to do in my books is to, in a sense, kind of bring people back to life. And if in any way I brought Mrs. Shigamura or Frank or Mr. Shigamura back to life and get people to pay attention to sentiments like she expressed in that letter, then that's really my purpose. So this is the president of Carleton College at the time, Larry Gould. And so he receives this letter from Mrs. Shigamura, and it's the beginning of a long relationship between the two. So he would write to her, she would write back, and that sort of thing. And it's really kind of interesting that every time she would write, she would include a check. So when she sent the previous letter, she said, "I really appreciate the booklet. I want to pay for the publication of it." Mr. Gould, President Gould would write back, and she would write back, and again, another check would come. So every time they did this, there was this donation. Finally, President Gould started to have some concerns about this. And in part, this became because someone visited Seattle. So someone went from the development office in Carleton, went out to Seattle and said, "I'd really like to look up the Shigamuras." And they said, "Oh, Mr. Shigamura works here in the train station. He's a porter." So they were living primarily off of tips. And then Carleton discovered that they were living in a one-room apartment with very little furnishing and really giving most of their money to Carleton. So at this point, the president tries to find ways to discourage them from giving any further gifts without embarrassing them. And he writes this: "I've written so many letters of appreciation for the gifts you've made to Carleton College that I've run out of appropriate adjectives. I hope you will have forgotten the words I said in my earlier letters, so the ones I write to you now might sound fresh. I do hope, however, that both of you good people will feel that you've given us sufficient material assurance of your appreciation of what Carleton meant to Frank. I hope you will not feel impelled to continue to make donations to the college. I'm sure you understand what I mean by these words. I mean that your concern for Carleton College should never interfere with the welfare and needs of Frank's parents." So, being a teacher at Carleton, I'm very moved when I read Mrs. Shigamura's letter, and then very glad that my college at that time would respond in such a way. Then it moves kind of into another point. So the Shigamuras had never really traveled anywhere in the States except when they were removed to camp. And Carleton invites them out for a convocation, which is a weekly sort of event. And so these are some newspaper articles from the Minneapolis Tribune that are kind of talking about the story and about how Carleton has developed this relationship with the Shigamuras, and that there's a scholarship. They gave enough money that there's a scholarship. And down in the lower corner there, you can see Annie Kaneshiro, who is the first recipient of the Frank Shigamura Scholarship. That scholarship continues today. And this is a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Shigamura about taking their accepting to attend. And this is, again, a page of my book. So this is when they visited the college. And so on the right, you see Annie Kaneshiro. She hosted them at dinner. At that point, there was separate dining between males and females on the college. And so she was in a women's dining hall, and that's her hosting the Shigamuras. And it was really wonderful for the college to have done that. This is Frank's enlistment photo, and it is just another page in the book, kind of talking about, again, more letters from Mrs. Shigamura. And this is the Shigamura room. So one thing that pleased me was that initially when I saw that plaque on the door, it was on kind of a shabby room. And I encouraged the college over some time to consider updating the Shigamura room, because it's funny, how plaques work at colleges and that sort of thing. They're just a bunch of names. And I wanted this to be a little bit more than a name. And so I was really glad when the college really did a very nice remodeling of a room. And then they included some of the prints that came from the book. I'm going to go back one second. One thing that's really kind of a nice conclusion to this story is that the next president after President Gould at Carleton College was John Nason. So he was the president during the 60s, which was not the easiest time to be a college president. But what happened at that time was that Mr. Shigamura passed away in the 60s. And at that time, Mrs. Shigamura engaged a lawyer to try to set up an estate for Carleton College. And this letter came, and I include this in the book, from the lawyer to John Nason saying, she asked me to set up an estate. I went to her home. It's just a one-room apartment. They really don't have any money. What do you want me to do? And I think about John Nason maybe being alone in his office and reading that letter and just knowing what happened behind that, and then thinking that that's one of 4,000 students. Nason didn't pull a lot of attention to himself, but he was somebody that really created some very important things. And this is me in the center there with the Shigamura family. I was asked to give a talk at the Nisei Veterans Committee, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a few minutes, in Seattle. It was formed by veterans returning from the war. And when I was there, the Shigamuras turned out, which was really fun to meet the relatives. And the man down in the lower right, this man, talked to me afterwards, and I'll just share this. I was talking about how generous Mrs. Shigamura was, and he came up and he goes, "You really got it right on Auntie." And he said that when he first got his driver's license, Mrs. Shigamura was visiting their home, and the father said, "Drive Auntie home," which he did. And so he walked her to the door, and she said, "Well, here's $5. And he said, "No, I can't take that." She wanted to pay for gas or whatever, give him something. And he goes, "I can't take that." So there was an apartment. So she crumpled up the bill and she threw it out in the hall, and she goes, "Well, somebody's going to take it," which I just thought was really a touching story. But I was really glad to meet the Shigamura family. Okay, that leads me to the second book. This is Shiro Kashino, who was one of the really important founding members of the Nisei Veterans Committee. So now I'm going to be talking about this second book and kind of moving into a different story. But because I had done the Frank Shigamura story, I received an email from Debbie Kashino, who is Shiro Kashino's daughter, saying, "We started researching Frank Shigamura and you came up." So this became a good friendship. And I started to learn about Shiro Kashino's story. And it was also just as powerful as the Frank Shigamura story to me. And so I did a second book. So that's what I'm going to speak up about now. So one of the important things to know is, Shiro Kashino was a very highly regarded, received multiple medals and that sort of thing. But like others, he came back to communities that hadn't really welcomed Japanese people. And so when the veterans returned to some of these communities, including Seattle, they weren't allowed to join the VFW because of their Japanese descent. And so they decided to set up their own organization, which is the Nisei Veterans Committee, which continues to this day. So this book is really quite large. It uses archival photographs of the camp and that sort of thing. And it talks about a few things, about Shiro Kashino's story in particular, about the fact that so many of the veterans were not allowed to join veterans organizations when they return, etc. And I'm going to read one of the letters. So some of the soldiers that returned immediately tried to join the VFW. And this is the letter from one person who was denied this. I have received your letter of June 8th, 1945, telling me that post number 51 VFW has rejected my application for membership. Your letter indicates that the sole reason for the rejection was the fact that I am of Japanese ancestry. 12 months ago, on a hot day, I was lying in the fields near Pisa, my right leg shattered by a German bullet. I lay there in that field for 10 hours, half delirious from pain, almost crazed with fear of enemy artillery that burst around me. That day, I didn't know whether I would ever again set foot on American soil. Today, on American soil, thousands of miles from Pisa, I have been wounded again by another weapon, hypocrisy, prejudice, call it what you will. Little did I expect as I lay wounded on that battlefield that upon my return to home, the people for whom I fought and suffered, I would be repudiated. Again, I'm using sort of archival letters and that sort of thing. So these are not things that I sort of make up. In a way, I just sort of curate them. This is Shiro Kashino and his wife Louise before their marriage, actually, but before he left for service. So this just gives you an idea of sort of the scale of the book and kind of how they would look. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Shiro Kashino. He was, by any accounts, just a great hero of the 442nd. And but when he returned, he had numerous injuries, and he decided to go to a trade school. But even after receiving his certificate in trades, he wasn't allowed to enter a union when he returned to Seattle. But he did become the commander of the Nisei Veterans Committee and did a number of things there, including raising money for a large monument in Lakeview Cemetery for the Nisei veterans. And I visited that. It's just a few yards away from Frank Shigamura's grave, as a matter of fact. This is a typical example of some of the food lines and that sort of thing of the Japanese unit. And I'm going to read a few of the comments from Shiro Kashino that are included in the book. One is, after the war was over, we had to guard some Japanese prisoners. I remember looking down on this compound, and it reminded me of camp. This was exactly what they had built for us in the deserts of Idaho. We had to prove our loyalty, so I figured if this is what it's going to take, I had better go. Just another example of the pages from the book. Another quote from from Louise Kashino. So again, this goes back to the removal and how they didn't know what was going to happen for them. So Louise said before the removal, packing up just what we could carry was very hard. We had to go to the pickup point in 2 taxis because there were 7 of us. We had no friends who had offered to take us. Shiro was, the 442nd is the most decorated unit per capita in the war. Their battles included the Battle of the Lost Battalion and the Gothic Line. In the Gothic Line is really interesting. In April of 1945, the Army had tried unsuccessfully for 5 months to break the German defenses known as the Gothic Line. They were up on a high ground. The 442nd was given the order to make the attempt. And at night, instead of coming up from the front, they went around behind, and at night they climbed a 3,000-foot cliff to surprise the Germans from the rear. Any soldier who fell had to remain silent in order to preserve the surprise. If the Germans had discovered the effort, the battalion would have been exposed on the cliff. But surprised from the rear, the Germans surrendered to the 442nd in just a few hours. Shiro participated in all of their most well-known battles, including the Battle of Lost Battalion, where they went in and, at great loss to the 442nd, liberated a Texas battalion that had been surrounded, as well as the Gothic Line. Shiro was awarded 6 Purple Hearts, 2 Bronze Stars, and 1 Silver Star, along with other commendations. At one point, his wounds were serious enough that he was offered to be returned home, but he refused and returned to the fighting. At one point during downtime, this is kind of where the story makes a change. A bar fight broke out between some soldiers, and a Hawaiian Nisei punched a white soldier. 4 Nisei were put in a stockade for court-martial, including Shiro Kashino. They were released to continue fighting, and one of the four was killed during that fighting. But then afterwards, they were returned to court-martial. The soldier who threw the punch would not admit it, so the remaining three were court-martialed, losing rank and pay. So despite the fact that he had done what he had done in the fighting, Shiro was treated in that way. Now, this is a photo of the Hawaii reunion. So the 442nd started reunions about 10 years after the war. And in the first one or two, Shiro went by himself. They didn't really have funds to bring the whole family. But in this one, the whole family was able to attend. And what's interesting about this is my friend Debbie Kashino told me that, well, I'll just read her comment. I was 11 when we went to the first one in Hawaii. We saw all these people on the tarmac, and I think it was like 2 in the morning. And we were wondering what all these people were there for. And this is when she realized what her father meant to the 442nd, because the tarmac was packed with people meeting them in the middle of the night. Oh, back, excuse me. So the event of him being charged with this court-martial charge was really very, very unfair. And it went on for years. The members of the 442nd felt that it was very wrong and that he really should have been given the Congressional Medal of Honor instead. And so they, on their own, not with Shiro helping them, started a campaign to sort of get his case reopened. And this included contacting the soldier in Hawaii that had thrown the punch, who finally admitted it. And yet still, this got turned down. Unfortunately, Shiro died in 1997, and this was just before this case was finally resolved. I'm going to read a letter from Louise Kashino that she wrote to the sort of final board that was considering this. If this application can be reconsidered and the stigma of a court-martial of dubious circumstances erased, we will be grateful knowing that justice has been served and my husband vindicated. If the application is once again denied, my only consolation will be the fact that he died not knowing he had lost his last battle. That's Louise Kashino. So that was finally reversed, unfortunately, after his death, of course, but it still meant a great deal to the family. So in conclusion, I just want to say that I look back at this, I didn't know anything about the removal, the incarceration, anything about the history when I went to college. And then I did learn some about it. And then I kind of accidentally found out about the Shigamura story. And then through that work, I found out so much more and have been in touch with people like the Kashinos and other people that I could mention here. And it became a really significant part of my research, of my work, and maybe of what I hope I contribute as an artist. And that's been my goal. So I think I'll conclude there. I'm going to stop sharing and then see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Fred, for providing this most informative and moving discussion on the heroic contribution of two of the volunteers of the 44nd Japanese American Combat Unit to the U.S. engagement in Europe during World War II. It's an important but lesser known aspect of Japanese American contributions to U.S. capabilities in that conflict. And more broadly, for sharing the context in which and the means by which these young soldiers, these young men were able to serve and the challenges they faced in fulfilling their commitment to support the U.S. and prove their loyalty. Kathy, do you have a question?
Yeah, and thank you again, Fred. That was a great talk. And one of my questions has to do with the Smithsonian exhibition. Really does a great job of talking about the personal struggles of people and the lives that they had while they were incarcerated. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't really talk a lot about what happened after they were released or after World War II ended. And you mentioned briefly something about veterans coming back from the war and not being allowed to join the VFW. Were there other discriminatory practices that you encountered towards Japanese, either soldiers or people in the camps once they were back in the United States and back in the National Society?
You know, one of the sad parts of that is that well-intentioned Eleanor Roosevelt had tried to help in a sense, and they created a questionnaire that would kind of help some of the people in the camps to establish their loyalty. But there were two questions in particular that were very difficult for them to answer, particularly those people that had never been allowed to be US citizens. So one of the questions was, would you give up any chance of being a citizen of Japan? So these were people that couldn't be citizens of the US in many cases. And if they gave that up, they would be citizens of nowhere, right? So answering, also there were people who said, I would be very willing to, once the draft happened, because the draft actually took place too. So the initial soldiers that went in were all volunteers, but then the draft affected people that were in the camps too. And there were some people who said, I would be very willing to serve, but not while my family's in a concentration camp. So those people were sent to prison. Those were the no-no boys, right? So you had people that could not establish their loyalty in the proper way, and some were even returned to Japan. So in some cases, after the war, there might have been people that had lived in the US for 20, 30 years, but they hadn't really established citizenship, and then didn't answer the question correctly, were sent back to Japan, right? So, and you can imagine what they faced in post-war Japan, with questions of loyalty and all that sort of thing, having their lives just totally turned upside down. And there were difficulties about returning. There were some places where they said, we don't want them back because people had done all kinds of things. They turned over temporary leases, or they lost property, or that kind of thing. But some, as families tried to sort of reestablish themselves, there were some really terrible editorials in newspapers saying, we don't want them back, make them go to other places and that sort of thing. So there were lots of ways in which the return was difficult. Now, in Shiro Kashino's case, something that turned out really kind of interesting was he got a job selling cars at a Ford dealership. And because it was Shiro, all the Japanese went to that dealership. So he couldn't work in his sort of chosen field, but he ended up in that, and he was a really successful car salesman because he was the person to see if you were from the Japanese community.
Great, thank you.
A lot of it was people returning to farms and that sort of thing. And there've been all kinds of difficult relationships where people had kind of taken advantage of the situation. In some cases, their farms were run down or that sort of thing. So there were lots of difficult stories about just the return in general.
Well, again, Fred, thank you very much for this presentation and a most moving and informative discussion in helping us to understand challenges facing the Japanese American community throughout the war and their efforts to provide support to the U.S. and to. Thank you. For our audience, our speaker next month will be Rob Martinez, New Mexico's state historian. Rob will be speaking on one of a number of topics of interest to him. We always look forward to his presentations. So tune in on January 4th at noon to hear his talk. In closing, just a reminder that you can watch this and other presentations in the Friends of History First Wednesday lecture series on the Friends of History webpage, shown here. If you wish to learn more about our upcoming lectures or more broadly about the Friends of History, we urge you to join our mailing list, either via our webpage or by mailing us at the email address below. And do consider making a contribution if you can, however small, via our webpage. Once on the webpage, just click on the donate button at the top of the page. We look forward to seeing you all in the months ahead. Thank you and goodbye for now.